very much for a very inspirational and enlightening session. The issues that have been raised here, as we see, range from economic to policy related to social science and even social implications, including cultural issues, as we just saw. Can I, keeping the time in mind, can I just start opening the debate and invite audience to questions, please. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating session. I have questions to almost all of you, but I'll let me be very quick. To Mr. Chanda, what do you think are the implications of outsourcing going in the US context to move into high-end frameworks? You did briefly allude to it. You've seen, of course, the business process outsourcing development, but increasingly, this is as much as one would expect it to move into legal process outsourcing and high-end law firms in the US bringing work into India and other places. What's the future of it? And secondly, you did mention about the adverse consequences of outsourcing in the US when it comes to people losing jobs. Is it also part of the historical consumption patterns in the US, and to what extent the changed global economic environment and the rise of emerging markets is going to redefine US's own approaches, as well as both government and civil society and people, to redefine their own consumption patterns. The world has changed since all these new economies have emerged. So to what extent that is going to change? Secondly, to James, you talked about you mentioned about the working of the WTO, and indeed talked about US's particular involvement. Increasingly, countries are actually having bilateral agreements. There is a major threat to the multilateral trading regime, whereby if number of countries feel that it's far more easier to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement and have arrangements between them, as opposed to developing a complex level of consensus with a number of countries. And what I just wanted to hear your opinion, that is this going to be the trend where 2-3 countries come together, negotiate something, and have those arrangements between them? And if it is going to be the trend, what's going to be the future of WTO as an institution? To Amit, you talked about the excitement in the US for investing in India. Now, one of the major issues which I didn't hear much about in this panel, and maybe it would be good to hear from you, is to what extent the fact that India is not a rule of law society has any bearing whatsoever on American investment process or any country's investment process. Because India, 95% of property transactions in India are black money based. There is so much of cash revolving around. I mean, people bring in crores and crores of rupees as cash to buy properties, and that's considered a normal thing. If you go around Delhi, if you want to buy property, 70-30 is the going ratio. 70% you pay by cash, 30% by check. So bulk of our property transactions across the country, even in relatively organized rule of law regimes, even with people who earn their money through legitimate sources of income and have actually paid taxes, pay black money and pay through cash-based transactions. To what extent this is a barrier at all for an investor in the US is something which I would like to hear. Rupa, great presentation. Thank you so much. You talked about regulators and indeed deregulation and re-regulation. My question is, to what extent we can trust the regulators? Because one of the fundamental premises of a free market economy is that somehow markets will regulate it by themselves, and that's not so much because everybody's wedded to the market, but we have had, historically, we've had other ways to doing things, which is trusting the government, and hopefully the government will ensure that permissions are given to the people to do whatever they need to, so that we can ensure that So basically, we can ensure that things will be in order. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and so we have a huge trust deficit when it comes to the ability of regulators to maintain honesty, integrity, and ethical processes in their regulations. So my fear is, if we are going to trust the regulators, are we going to a stage where we might, what we came from after a long struggle, and how do we balance that? It's a great idea to bring in everybody to the table for the decision-making process, but at the end of the day, unless we have those individuals with honesty, integrity, and ethical framework to make those decisions, how do we ensure that they will be better? And that's why my fear of re-regulation may kindly be addressed. Shana, you were also talking about the excitement and also the inflow of capitals in India and all the deals which you mentioned. The fact of the matter is, all these deals which you're talking about has very, the impact in the Indian populace is relatively marginal. We still have almost 1/3 of India hugely questioning the very process of development. You have significant disparities of income and wealth leading to violence across the country at various levels. So one of the major challenges in India is, how do we balance the sort of larger societal interests and development goals along with this growth and boom story which is dominant, at least in the corporate sector? Sorry to bother you with all these questions.
Please, can you start with this?
It's a very, very interesting question, the question of consumption. The US economy, 72% of the economy is consumption, as opposed to say 32% in China. And that is the major imbalance that the Americans have to address. And this consumption has been built on credit. So now, since the 2007 crisis, Americans are selling like mad and trying to protect their homes and their assets by deleveraging. So that, of course, adds to the anxiety of losing job and to outsourcing. In terms of trends in the future, it is very clear that the call centers and the low-level outsourcing that was taking place in the 90s, these are going to go away from India, going to cheaper places. India's wages are rising. The area where I think the United States, Europe are extremely concerned is the high-end outsourcing in terms of innovation and R&D moving to outside the United States. Because it not only means that qualified people in the United States are losing jobs, but more broadly, innovation is the driver of the economy, and innovation is going out of the United States. And that is something that thinking Americans are very concerned that if the American industry loses that edge in terms of innovation, what will they do in the next 10, 15, 20 years? Of course, it is normal that the R&D moves closer to the consumers. The consumers are going to be in Asia, in China, India, Southeast Asia. So it makes sense for the corporations to move the R&D closer to the consumer to be in better touch with what the consumers want. So that, of course, is another factor. But the nature of outsourcing is certainly changing, and particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, they are breaking up the jobs in small segments, and they have been outsourced to different labs all over the world, and which is facilitating or expediting the process of R&D and trial, but it basically gives the United States hold. So one is very overtaken.
Can I please request audience as well as our panel members to allow everyone to have some time, and please be, pardon me for putting this restriction, be short in your questions as well as responses. Mr. Panodia, please.
The question that Raj raised, raised is, I think, the heart